Just wanted to, how about that? Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the IFMA Lehigh Valley organization. We are relatively new members, but have jumped right in with getting involved in presenting what we think is worthwhile, valuable content for the members. My name is Lou Fromm with Fromm Electric, as Mike said, and just a quick recap of Fromm. We are approaching 100 years old. We are a third generation family-owned company with branches basically from central Pennsylvania across the east to northeast PA, with 8 locations. And we are an electrical distributor that's lighting, electrical supplies, mostly B2B. And we do a little bit of appliance business, mostly to the builder and property management community. But we do focus on the fact where we don't want to just sell supplies, because a lot of it is commodity. So we do offer a lot of valuable services. And in this case, I'm happy to bring information to the IFMA community. This is sort of like a segue, I guess, from the last virtual presentation that focused on more of the HVAC relatable products that are offered to facility managers for air purification, especially in the COVID world. So this segue is more in the lighting world, I guess. They are non-traditional products per se, but they are in our world, and that's why we are presenting it to the organization. So that being said, again, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to start out with Andy Ahart with Signify, and he's going to present some products from that company.
Hold on a moment. I'm working on sharing screen here. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent, and you can hear me, even better. Okay, let's get going. So good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Ahart. I work for Signify. I'm a regional product marketing person. I've been in the lighting business for the last 20 years. And of course, with UVC coming on for what I'm going to talk about, which is specifically around air disinfection, upper air disinfection, is where our primary push is for this product type right now. So I'm going to hop into this presentation, roughly 30 minutes long. There should be plenty of time for Q&A as we get into this. One of the things to keep in mind when we start talking about upper air UVC, excuse me, is that upper air UVC systems are not a replacement for or really in competition with HVAC systems that disinfect air. These are really supplementary to them. So when you look at air disinfection in regards to UVC, it is absolutely important to have the HVAC system working in tandem with other systems in order to achieve high rates of disinfection for a space. So want to throw that out there. It's one of those key points that it comes up in many conversations, because you look at these things and say, well, we're doing this with HVAC. It's like, well, I understand, and that's great. And there's other things we can do to make it even better. So this is where UVC for upper air systems come into play, or for air purification systems that maybe in room come into play. So let's talk a little bit about history. Unfortunately for all of us, the history of pandemics is long and fairly well recorded. So what we're experiencing right now with COVID-19 is one of many. And if we go back in time and we look at some of the things that have happened, for example, smallpox, Ebola, et cetera, the list goes on and on. You can see this list goes back to 1915, sorry, 1915. And we have this long laundry list of all the things that have happened. So this is just another one that is upon us. And unfortunately, the theme here is it's not going to be the last one, right? So this is unfortunately the way it goes. So let's talk about disinfection. Why does air and surface disinfection in a space really matter? I think we all know this material exceedingly well, so I'm not going to harp on it for very long. The rate of transmission. One of the things that's interesting about COVID-19 is when we started this, and I'm going to poke some fun at all of us, but when we started this whole thing at the beginning of last year, there was the great toilet paper shortage of 2020, and you couldn't find toilet paper. And then right after that, we had the great hand disinfectant, hand sanitizer shortage, couldn't find that. And then through this pandemic, we've learned that the rate of transmission is not really through surfaces as much as it is through aerosol. So meaning that it's in the air more so than it's on the surfaces. So we got through the toilet paper debacle, we got through the hand sanitizer shortage. Now we understand that more than anything, it's transmitted through the air. So disinfecting the air is definitely important in ensuring that we have safe spaces so that people can actually go back into the spaces and use the spaces, whether that is a school or retail or hospitality, you name it. And that's where upper air systems come into play. So that's where the focus of most of my presentation is going to be on is a UVC system that is all about ensuring that the upper air part of the room is being disinfected. So we look at an upper air system, and we all understand that body heat is definitely causing the air to circulate, that the HVAC system is also causing the air to circulate in the space, thereby mixing the air so that we're not just disinfecting the air that's in the upper part of the room, we're getting all the air in the space. And we've got lots of calculations that show how all this stuff works. So in support of that, I have some things I want to share with you guys. First off, the Wall Street Journal did a video on this in March of this year, where they had a full simulation video, and they were talking about things like masking and ventilation and air filtration. And one of the things that was interesting is they were talking about ventilation, and they're showing in their video, you can see this video in the middle, they're talking about, hey, open a window in a classroom and put a fan in the classroom. Well, you guys are in the Northeast. I'm sure it's a little different there. I actually live in Houston, Texas, and down here in Houston, it's crazy hot. So our school classroom windows don't open because all you would do is let in the heat, humidity, and the bugs. So we're tasked with how do we increase ventilation? How do we increase the rate of disinfection with the air when there is no option to open the window? And office spaces are tasked with the same challenge, right? So that's where we get into this. Okay, what do we do to supplement the air system we already have, as opposed to, hey, open a window? It's not always an option. There is another interesting video that came out, and this one's actually a video plus a simulation. So the New York Times did a very similar type of presentation where they go through and talk about how do we return to spaces safely? How do we disinfect the air? How does COVID move through the air? So there is a video in the bottom right-hand corner. There's a little QR code. You could zap this with your phone and view this video. They actually did a full-blown simulation about how air particles move through a space. So again, really interesting stuff, speaking to air, disinfecting the air, and making the space safer to occupy. So let's talk through a little bit of research now. So there's some more contemporary data, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Now let's talk about some research that's been done in support of the same thing. So this is an article that came out. I've got all the pertinent details about the article are on the left side, and I'm going to show some excerpts from the article on the right side. And there's only a few of these, so we're not going to get into the depth of this article. It is a long piece. It is many pages long. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, this is one of those articles that could definitely help you out. So let's talk about some of the excerpts here. So this fellow named Edward Nardell with Harvard Medical School did a great big research piece on ultraviolet UVC and COVID-19 specifically. So one of the things that is part of the understanding about how these systems work is that when you're talking about UVC and the effect of UVC on a space is pathogen specific. So what the heck does that mean? It means that when you expose UVC to COVID-19, it's going to behave, the rate of disinfection is going to be different than if you did it for common flu or if you did it for something worse like tuberculosis. So it is pathogen specific. So this research article in particular was all about COVID-19. So we're looking at UVC specifically for the pathogen COVID-19. So first excerpt at the top here, he says, only 2 established room-based technologies are available to supplement mechanical ventilation: portable room air cleaners and upper room germicidal UVC. So that's where I'm focusing a bunch on my presentation, is all about upper room germicidal UVC. The presenter after me, I believe, is going to talk a bit more about portable room air cleaners and some other technology to help with the same thing. My focus is really about upper room germicidal UV, and it is, again, supplemental to mechanical ventilation. So he goes on in this article to talk about how SARS-CoV-2 is highly susceptible to germicidal UV, which is ultimately UVC, and it is an 80-year-old technology that's been shown to safely, quietly, effectively, and economically produce the equivalent of 10 to 20 or more air changes per hour under real-life conditions. So again, more backup data to support the fact that this stuff works, and it's been around a long time. Some of the earliest research on UVC goes back to Duke University in the 1930s, and that was all around tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, as pathogens go, is actually more difficult to disinfect than COVID-19. So we know this stuff works, and it's been doing it for a very long time. So final point here, he says, quantitatively, where applicable, no other technology approaches the equivalent air changes per hour that can be produced by upper room UV silently, safely, and cost effectively. So final point I want to make on this is that when you look at all the alternatives that are out there for disinfecting a space, and specifically disinfecting the air in a space, upper room UVC systems do it completely silently. So especially when you look at classrooms, office spaces, meeting rooms, even hospitality, you're not introducing a noisemaker into the space because this is a silent light source, essentially. Okay, so let's talk about UVC. How does it work? What does it do? I'm going to give you guys a brief history here. I'm sure that some people on this presentation are exceedingly aware of how this stuff works, but for those of you that aren't, I'm going to give a quick explanation of it. So first off, what is UVC? UVC is ultraviolet. When we say C, the C part of UVC is all about the bandwidth of it. So we've got to go back to high school science class here for a second. We're going to talk about sunlight. So the great big ball of light in the sky, the sun, irradiates the Earth, and much of the UV is blocked by our ozone layer, blocked by the atmosphere of the Earth. Thankfully, UVC is blocked by the atmosphere of the Earth because UVC itself is actually fairly harsh. Some UVB gets through, a whole lot more UVA gets through, and there's some explanations here in the middle of the screen. So you can see that UVA, you can use it for sun tanning, insect traps. UVB, of course, we use it for phototherapy. And then UVC we use for disinfection. So UVC that we have here on the surface of the Earth is all artificially created. We've been doing this, as the Edward Nardell paper talked about in the last slide. We've been doing this for 80 years. And it's a really reliable technology. We know what we're doing with it. We know how to treat it. We know how to work with it. And this artificial UVC that we create is highly effective at disinfecting. And let's talk about technologies for what we call UV or ultraviolet and how they affect what we're doing with disinfection. So I'm going to give you guys a quick explanation of the 3 main technologies that are out there. I'm going to start with the least effective and go to the most effective, or rather the least commercially used to the most commercially used. Let's put it that way instead. So the first one up is the purple light, 405 nanometer, because again, when we look at the UV spectrum, we're actually dealing with bandwidths of light. So visible to invisible. If you look at the scale at the bottom left of the screen, we have this visible spectrum of light between 400 to 700 nanometers. We go to the far right, we get an infrared. If we go to the far left, we go to ultraviolet. So we're specifically talking ultraviolet. Right at the cusp of where we go invisible is 405 nanometer. So cool technology. It is effective at disinfecting bacteria, less effective on viruses, and the stuff is everywhere. So there's some big brands that have 405 nanometer, and you can get on Amazon and buy all sorts of purple lights that generate 405 nanometer today. Here's the catch with it. All the research supports that 405 nanometer works with long exposures, meaning hours. So if you go to Amazon and you buy a purple light wand and wave it over your desk, it didn't do anything because the exposure is simply not long enough. So most of the 405 nanometer products out there require hours of being in use in order to provide an effect. That was unique. Okay, so let's hop over to the next one. Next one is 222 nanometer. So this is a cool technology, relatively new on the scene, shows a lot of promise, has recently been updated from a safety perspective. So one of the things that's interesting about 222 is that it's actually getting really close to the peak effectiveness. So I've got a chart in the bottom center of the screen. It's a really kind of a spike chart. And the spike of that chart is right at 254 nanometers. Technically it's 250, sorry, it's, you know, I have to pull my glasses off. Sorry, 265 is the actual peak. So we're darn close to it with 254, 222 is really close. Bear with me on the explanation. I'll get to that in just a second. So 222 is really close to that peak effectiveness from a germicidal perspective. It is recently updated from a UL perspective. It is a newer technology. It is not in wide use yet. There are some using it. One of the complications with it is that you do have to limit the amount of time that you're exposed to it. But again, it shows promise, and I hope 222 evolves. The simple thing I want you to understand about 222 is that it is limited use at this point because it is relatively new from a technology perspective for UVC. And now we're going to talk about the tried and true, the one that's been tested for the last, it's been around for 80 years. It's been tested extensively for 40 years. And this is where we get into 254 nanometer. Quite technically, it's 253.7, but let's just round up to 254. It makes it a lot easier. So 254 nanometer is the wavelength of energy that's being emitted from the vast majority of UVC sources out there. It's the most effective. We know what we're doing with this stuff. It disinfects bacteria and activates viruses and is highly effective. And we've been using this stuff for a very long time. So what in the world does this do? Because this 254 nanometer is where almost everybody is centered around in the industry, not just Signify, but everybody. So why 254? What does it do? Well, first off, with a short-term exposure, we're talking from minutes, maybe 15 to 20 minutes at most. It will kill bacteria and it will inactivate viruses. So I'm actually married to a biologist. My wife knows all about microbiology, and she's corrected me dozens of times that you can't kill a virus because a virus is not alive. And I say, yes, I understand. But I'm a lighting guy, so I've learned to repeat this, but the science is beyond me. So it kills bacteria, it inactivates viruses, and that leaves them harmless. So they won't grow back, they don't come back after they've been inactivated or killed, and that's what the UV energy wavelength will actually do. So 254 nanometers is highly effective at creating this effect so that we can disinfect the spaces. So before I jump into products, do I need to pause for any questions? Do we have any questions right now?
Andy, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I will just remind all of our attendees that if you do have questions for Andy or the following co-host, just put them in the chat box and I'll interject. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's talk products. So I've chatted a bit about the technology, given you guys a background of UVC, how this stuff all works. We know it's effective at disinfection. Now let's talk about how we can actually implement products. So within Signify, we have multiple different product types. The ones I'm going to focus on primarily are going to be the air that are on the far left, upper air, both a ceiling mount and wall mount. We also have surface disinfection that do exactly what it sounds like. This is where the UV energy is actually going to come straight down through the space onto surfaces. And then we also have equipment chambers that are on the far right. So these are our 3 tiers of available products today. Many of the applications that we've installed are air or surface. Every now and then, there's a combination of both. Also, I'll show you an application where that's been used. And then the equipment UVC chambers. This is where you have, say, shared equipment, equipment changing hands. The number one purpose for the equipment chambers, I'm not going to go into great details in an explanation of them, so I'm going to give you the quick rundown of them right now. Chambers were originally designed for agriculture. So specifically for the livestock business. So wherever you have a breeding center, breeding facility for whatever livestock it may be. There are many facilities where these breeding facilities are 100% indoors, and they will have every single employee take their personal effects, cell phones, keys, wallet, everything, put them into one of these chambers. They will disinfect it. So there's a clean side, a dirty side entry and a clean side exit for each one of these chambers. And they do that in order to reduce the pathogen exposure for their breeding facilities, because we've all heard about things like swine flu and hoof and mouth disease, and these things can be very detrimental to any sort of livestock facility. So that's where chambers really come in primarily. They've also been used in retail some, but primarily their focus is agriculture. So let's talk about air disinfection. I've got an example for you. So this gentleman with Forte Partners is talking about how they have installed the upper air UV systems, the ceiling mount version, in order to disinfect the spaces so that their employees can work in their offices safely and know that the air is constantly being disinfected. I have another example for you. We're going to hop to a retail application. This one's in Germany. Again, bear with me here. Signify is a global company, so we've done this all over the world. And so in Germany, they've actually installed the wall mount unit on columns within a grocery store, and they're disinfecting the air in the grocery store continuously, again, in order to ensure that people can return back to their stores safely and know that the air is being disinfected. Again, you can see it's supplemental to air systems, aiding the air system and providing a safer space as opposed to, replacing something in the air system. Here's yet another example. This one is a coffee shop in Korea where they've done the same thing virtually as Forte Partners with the offices. In this coffee shop example, they have multiple upper air ceiling mounted systems that are providing disinfection for the air. And they've done this across many, many retail stores for their coffee shops in Korea. And again, same thing. It's disinfect the air, allow people to return back to the space. And one of the things that is critical to understand with the upper air systems is that you can use the space while the systems are energized, because when it is properly designed and commissioned, they're perfectly safe to use the space while the system is energized.
Andy,
So
I do have a question, Andy, if I may interject here.
Go ahead.
One of the attendees has asked, does this equipment break down the COVID the same way it breaks down other viruses?
Yes. No, great question. So that is one of the things with the design, implementation, and commissioning of these systems, is that we will actually assist, if you like us to assist, with how many units do you want to use in a space, how much energy is being emitted from the actual luminaire, how much is being absorbed by the pathogens in the air, and ultimately, which pathogen are you trying to get rid of? So we've done lots of these for COVID specifically, and based on all the science that we have that shows how much UV is being emitted, how long it takes for exposure to inactivate COVID, absolutely highly effective at doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. And that is one of the things that gets really interesting. And again, the math that makes all this stuff work is a little bit over my head, but it is really hey, how much UV energy is being emitted and which pathogen? Pathogen meaning, are we getting rid of COVID? Are we getting rid of influenza? Is it tuberculosis? Is it whatever it is? We have to do that based on the pathogen. So COVID is actually quite easy to get rid of compared to some others like tuberculosis. So let's head back over here to the products again. So I'm showing the two different examples. I've got a couple classroom examples where we have the upper air systems, one for ceiling mount, one for wall mount. So let me show you some of the details about these. Here's the upper room system for ceiling mount. So this is a 2x2 grid mount. Also, we've had some applications where folks have suspended these. So they've actually used tethers and suspended them from a ceiling. However, it does go into a 2x2 grid perfectly. And you can see there's some design guidelines. So with both of these upper air systems that I'm showing you, you can buy them off the shelf from us through FROM. And as an off-the-shelf product, we have the design guidelines, we have the commissioning guides, we have the instructions. It's got all the proper labeling that comes with it. So you can source these and install these on your own if you like. or we can also engineer the space for you. So two different approaches. One is, hey, we can provide these as an off-the-shelf solution and you can install them on your own. The other way is if you said to us, hey, we really want the details, then we can work with you in order to design them per the space in order to ensure that you're getting the rated disinfection, that they're installed in the right place, that they're commissioned in the right place. We can do all that. So two different approaches, off the shelf or what I call engineered solution. So either way. So here's some of the minimum design guidelines. You can see that we need a 9-foot ceiling height. That is to ensure that the UV is staying well away from people's heads. Another piece is distance between fixtures as well as distance between fixtures and the wall. So one question that always comes up with UVC is, we know with lighting that light bounces around a space, right? We have reflectances of walls and ceilings and floors. Light bounces around a space. Does that happen with UVC? The answer is yes, it does. So we need to ensure that it's high enough and it's installed properly so that the UV wavelengths do not come down and hit the people in the space. So there's some design guidelines around how we do that. There's also commissioning guides, installation guides, labeling, you name it. We've got all that stuff covered. So the next one up is wall mount. So this one is a little bit different. You can see with the previous one that it was circular, the UV is coming out 360 degrees on all sides. With this one, it is specifically for wall mount and it shoots the UV up across the ceiling plane. So it's a little bit of a different style, has different design guidelines, needs to be installed a little bit higher. We need more space between the luminaires. We also need to ensure that we don't have any sort of obstruction, meaning a column or another wall or anything else directly in front of the luminaire so that the UV can stay up in the ceiling plane and not bounce down into the space. So there's some design guideline differences between the ceiling mount and the wall mount. But again, not that big of a deal. We follow the design guidelines, we follow the commissioning standards and the instructions, and they're safe to install. So
Andy,
here's another.
Before you move to the next slide, we do have two questions while you're back on the two products. One you may have answered, but just for point of clarification for this attendee, has there been any research done with underfloor air distribution versus overhead air distribution? And would there be any impact on the results of this equipment?
Underfloor, meaning like a raised floor?
No, what I think they're getting to, and I can ask this person to unmute themselves to clarify, but I think what they're looking at is there.
Yes, yes, underfloor, raised access floor, underfloor air distribution.
Okay, thank you, Priscilla.
Sure, sorry.
If anything, it would, I'm not the scientist on this stuff, so I'm just going to have to give you the best answer I can. But all of our analysis on this is based on usage of the space. You know, what are the heat makers in the space? We've got people in the space that causes convection. We also have air systems in the space. And so we take the number of air changes per hour. So let's use a classroom, for example. A classroom is designed around somewhere between 4 to 6 air changes per hour. We're taking the calculations of how many air changes per hour into account when we look at the UVC system and how the air is moving, because the air changes going through the space where the UVC is affects the rate of disinfection. So I can't speak to upper, ceiling mount air versus floor mount air. Ultimately, I think it's going to come down to air changes per hour.
Priscilla, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I
We
hope that helps.
do have a second question on the devices as well, Andy. Let me ask this one.
Go ahead.
Can people be in the space when the system is running?
Absolutely. With upper air systems designed properly. Yes, absolutely. We've done this many times. So when you see these applications like the coffee shop I showed, the grocery store, as well as office spaces, these are absolutely designed to be working while people are in the space.
Okay.
So we design and install these so that the UV stays way up in the ceiling plane where, unless you had Yao Ming walking through the space, no one's head is going to be that high.
All right, thank you. And I don't think Yao's playing anymore.
No, he's not. He's really not.
Okay.
I think his height and his weight messed up his ankles beyond his playing ability. Okay, so let's talk about applications. So classrooms, facilities, absolutely. We can put these in offices, retail. We can put these in medical office spaces. So the luminaires that I've shown are not for use where medical care is being provided. So they're not for use in patient rooms. They're not for use in operating rooms. However, they can be used in hallways. They can be used in medical office buildings, like patient waiting areas. Absolutely, we've done that. However, they're not, as I said, they're not for spaces where healthcare is being provided. Patient rooms, no. Operating rooms, no. Anywhere else, they're absolutely fine. So let's talk about surface disinfection for just a moment, and then I'll go into a couple of the listing things and we'll wrap up. So a quick difference here. So I actually have an example. This is showing a hybrid solution. So the question that I got, last question was, can these be used while people are in the space? The answer is yes for air systems. However, we're going to switch over and show direct systems. Direct systems are for use only when the space is unoccupied. So we have an example here of a grocery store in Poland where they've actually done a hybrid solution. So they use the air system during the day when shoppers are in the space. And then at night, after the space is empty, they will energize the surface mount, basically meaning turn on the surface mount UVC to disinfect the countertops in the butcher area, the meat area. So you can see that we have all sorts of meats behind a piece of glass with countertops. So at night, when the space is unoccupied, they will turn on the surface mount luminaires and disinfect the countertops and the cutting boards and whatever else is in that space. And one of the things that's interesting about UVC is that it does not go through glass. So the meat underneath the glass is not getting exposed. So perfectly safe there also. So this is a little bit of a hybrid solution that is using both surface and air, different times a day, one when occupied, one when unoccupied. And so let's hop over to the unoccupied solution. So this is where we talk about surface luminaires for direct disinfection. So this is where a luminaire is mounted to the ceiling and it is shooting UV energy directly down onto surfaces. So restrooms, locker rooms, gymnasiums, things like that, wherever there's lots of people using a space regularly and you want to disinfect countertops, sinks, doorknobs, you name it, you can do this. So here's where this thing gets a little bit more interesting, is that with surface luminaires for direct disinfection, you have to have controls in place to ensure that the space is unoccupied, because you cannot use these systems while people are there. It simply wouldn't be safe for people to occupy the space while these are in use. So we have controls that go in tandem with these systems to ensure that it is being used safely. So one quick thing I'll answer on this always comes up is, what about direct surface disinfection and air? Well, here's the cool thing, is that when these luminaires are mounted in the ceiling and the energy is coming straight down to the surfaces, it's going through the air. So it is disinfecting the air as it hits the surface. So it plays a dual role. The complicated part is you have to have controls in the space to ensure that it is being used safely. So lots of different applications where we see these being used. Of course, athletic facilities, gymnasiums, restrooms, locker rooms, you name it. Cool, yet kind of gross thing is that when you put UVC systems in locker rooms, it actually gets rid of a huge component of the smell, because almost all the smell comes from bacteria. So this gets rid of that. Cool little factoid for you. So I talked a moment about equipment. I'm not going to harp on this for very long. Simply say that equipment is used in the medical field all the time for medical devices. It is also used heavily in agriculture. We see some places where this gets used in retail, but ultimately it finds its way into its proper fit. So last couple things I'll talk about is, of course, as you'd expect from a global lighting luminaire provider like Signify, everything we do is UL. So we have all the UL certifications for the luminaires, for the controls. It's all UL listed, it's properly labeled, documented. We also have the instructions that go with it to ensure safe usage, as well as commissioning guidelines around how to commission the systems. And as long as proper design procedures and protocols are followed, we have the upper air systems that can be purchased and installed as an off-the-shelf solution, as well as we have the direct luminaires. So final thing is, When you look at direct luminaires, we have controls requirements to ensure safe usage for the direct systems, and we can assist with all that to ensure that it works properly. The one other thing I'll toss out there for some of the folks on this call who are probably a lot more controls savvy than I am, as we look at direct UVC systems that go into facilities, one of the questions that comes up occasionally is, hey, wouldn't this work with my building automation system? Couldn't I just use the sensors I have in place with my building automation system in order to ensure that it's being used properly? And the answer is no. And that's because of UL. So UL says for UVC direct systems, you have to use the controls that were tested with them, certified with them. So there's that one thing where we need to have the controls that were tested with the direct systems installed with them, so it can communicate into a facilities management system using BACnet or some other BMS protocol, but it does not necessarily allow you to use your building automation system as the safety system for UVC. So that's the final thing I'll toss out, specifically because we have some facilities folks on the call that probably know a lot more about this stuff than I do. So with that, I'll wrap up. I appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope this was educational and useful. Are there any other questions?
Andy, what I'm going to do, there are none in the chat, but so that this is still fresh in all the attendees' memories, why don't we open it up for questions for your piece of the presentation here? So if anybody has a question, please unmute yourself and ask the question of Andy. All right, well, that would tell me, Andy, you did a fantastic job. I'm going to turn it back over to Lou, and Lou's going to introduce our next presenter.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Andy. Great presentation. And I'm sure maybe if some of the folks didn't want to participate when Mike unmuted everybody, if there are additional questions other than the chat after this meeting, I did put it in the chat. My contact information is there with my email address, and I will coordinate and channel all inquiries and questions appropriately, and we'll basically be the quarterback for that. I see a chat about prices. They're not going to be published per se, so if there are interest in certain products, then why don't we take that offline, and I can work with the manufacturers to get you that information, based on what you're looking for per se. Okay, so now we are transitioning over to R0. JD Leclerc will be presenting based on, again, it's all under the same umbrella of disinfection, but R0 certainly has some incredibly amazing products, mostly this one that you see here, and JD will present on that. And again, put any questions in the chat, Mike will catch those, and at the end, we'll open it up for questions as well. You're on, JD.
Thank you, Lou. Appreciate it. Great job, Andy. I've been in the background, I think, expertly modifying my presentation as we go, so I am not hopefully redundant, because we are, our focus and goals are similar between Signify and R0. I am going to focus on a mobile whole room disinfection UVC system today. And I will avoid redundancy as much as possible in that discussion. So just a quick overview of R0. We are a biosafety technology company focused on a slew of interconnected IoT technology devices that are UVC based. And we are entirely focused on reducing the incidence of infection in a given space or building. I'll get into a little bit more about what that means, but this is probably maybe an oversimplification. Andy did a great job, obviously, with the history of UVC. I like to talk a little bit about disinfection, because we talk about, when we talk to different facilities folks, there's sometimes some confusion between cleaning, sanitization, and disinfection. And when we talk about disinfection, we're talking about inactivating or destroying or significantly reducing the pathogens in a given space. Those include viruses, bacteria, mold, and fungus. And in particular, at R0, when we're talking about disinfecting a space, we're talking about wholly disinfecting a space. So essentially bringing the pathogen load in a given space statistically to 0. And while UVC theoretically is a powerful disinfection technology and does inactivate all pathogens, the efficacy of UVC is predicated on the intensity of the light times the duration of exposure, which Andy also touched on. With our R0 ARC system that I'll be talking about today, our goal is to output enough germicidal UVC in a space to become operationally efficient and replace things like chemicals so that you can get into a space, disinfect quickly, an unoccupied space in the case of this particular product. Get in quickly, inactivate those pathogens, render them inert so they cannot be passed from one person to another, and do that in a operationally efficient fashion so that that space can be used and you can get back to normal in that space quite quickly. The industry really in disinfection has been dominated by a number of very old chemical companies, and they largely haven't changed. And most of the customers that we work with are replacing chemicals with UVC light. So it's kind of the most, the number one use case for engaging with R0 is around the notion of replacing chemicals for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it's generally considered unsafe, and that the custodial team members that have to suit up in full PPE to spray this stuff out, and then the dwell times and the inability to turn spaces for use, food safety issues, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of reasons why the industry and facilities people are kind of pushing away from chemicals. And so UVC is a great replacement for potentially, and in most scenarios, for chemical disinfection. The number one issue we believe with manual disinfection and chemical disinfection generally, this is going to sound maybe a little goofy, is that it doesn't generate or use data, which of course, you know, a human wiping down a desk doesn't generate data. Where that I think becomes interesting in this pandemic era, particularly in places like schools and other facilities and environments that are highly scrutinized by their stakeholders in their various communities, is there really hasn't been visibility into the disinfection process. So wiping down a space doesn't allow you to really get any insight on what the efficacy of those disinfection methods are. Our goal as a company with these IoT connected devices is to generate and use that data. So we want to feed back to our customer community where a device was, if it was on, and for how long it was run, so that it creates an audit and a data trail for that disinfection protocol and program, allowing you to prove back to your communities that you are disinfecting in a given space. And that's one of the things I'll talk about in the as I talk about the device itself. Ultimately, of course, we're concerned about reducing the incidence of infection, creating safer spaces for people. Also on the staffing side, we're seeing that we're fundamentally changing businesses by allowing staff to perform, meaning keeping people healthy enough so that they can be in these spaces performing and not and ultimately reducing sick days. So this is the mobile R0 ARC system. This is the use case for this device is essentially to be it can be rolled into an unoccupied space. So one example might be in a classroom in the evening as the custodial crews are going about their business of cleaning and manually disinfecting a given space, a classroom, for instance, taking out the trash, dusting, vacuuming. When they're done that, this device would be rolled into that space. A disinfection cycle would be executed, means the device is turned on and the light illuminates in that space. And then that crew moves on to the next room and does their other manual duties while this is on in that space. On average, we're targeting a 7-minute disinfection cycle. So you push this into the classroom, execute the disinfection cycle, you'd leave, it would run for 7 minutes, you'd come back, pull it out of that classroom, roll it over to the next space that you have in mind for disinfection, and do the same thing. As I mentioned about UVC, it's the power output of a given UVC becomes critically important in terms of operational efficiency or overall efficacy. And because the power output of this device is significant, we can get to disinfection rates of 7 minutes for 1,000 square feet. We've been tested to up to 5,000 square feet, but as a general guide to get your arms around how long it would take to disinfect a given space, our general guidance is 1,000 square feet in just 7 minutes. So again, roll it in, turn it on, leave, and come back in, and that the space that you have this system in is fully disinfected. We see this used in really two different ways. One, proactively. So as I mentioned, your custodial crews go about the business of, manually cleaning your spaces and manually disinfecting and perhaps spraying or applying chemicals to surfaces. This would tail that custodial crew and perhaps replace chemicals and allow them to disinfect spaces, once per evening. Another way we see it used is reactively. So whenever there's an outbreak or a suspected case of something like COVID, somebody sneezing or a fever breaks out in a part of a school or a facility, then this can be moved into that space where there's a suspected outbreak and ensure that that potential outbreak is contained by inactivating those pathogens and rendering them inert, so they're unable to be transferred from one person to another, either by air or surface. So this device does work for the air as a disinfection for point in time. So for the moment, obviously you move it in, for the air in that space will be disinfected in that moment. And then of course, any surface, any high touch surface or otherwise in that space would be disinfected as a result of exposure to the light that this system outputs. You'll see a lot of, in the UVC world, you see a lot of 4-log reduction figures, 99.99% inactivation rates. As Andy mentioned, there are different exposure levels required for different pathogens. Some are more difficult to inactivate than others. COVID, for instance, quite easy to inactivate with limited UVC exposure. When we talk about inactivating pathogens again in a space, we talk about all pathogen activity, and many of our customers do, of course, have an awareness of our vulnerability to the incidence of infection as a result of the pandemic today, but many of them are battling with pathogens outside of COVID. MRSA outbreaks are pretty common in some of the schools and some of the senior living facilities that we deal with. C. diff, staph, E. coli are all other issues. So while the pandemic has introduced us to the notion, I think generally, of the danger of infectious disease, we are concerned about all pathogens in a given space and reducing the incidence of infection for anything that might exist and negatively impact our communities. So in terms of the output of this device, and I'll get into a little bit of kind of feature function in a moment, but in terms of our outputs, they are verified by an independent DoD sanctioned lab in Bozeman, Montana, called Bioscience Labs. And so our outputs were measured. I'm happy to answer questions about those measurements if anybody wants to get into science and math, but at a high level, the summary of our reports prove out that this does do as we say it does in 1,000 square feet to fully inactivate pathogens in the 7 minutes. And the other great thing about light is, especially as it relates to replacement of chemicals, is when the light is on in the case of this particular device, it's not safe for exposure to human eyes and skin. Andy was talking about upper room UVGI. It's similar, but the exposure it's impossible to be exposed to an upper room system. This one, you roll into a center of the space, you turn it on. You don't want to be around it. So the use case is push it in, execute, leave the room, close the door. But when the light's on, it's doing its job in disinfecting the space. When the light is off, the space is completely safe for entry and use, including if there were food in that space. So if you left your lunch on the table and ran a disinfection cycle with lunch, you go back into that space and eat your lunch. There isn't any chemical dwell time. There's no reason to not use the space as soon as it's disinfected with light. So we can get back to work very, very quickly after a disinfection cycle with R0 Arc. And then again, this is an IoT connected device. So in the excuse me, sorry, in the handle of this device, we have an LTE radio, which is the same radio that's in your cell phone. And that allows us to collect usage metrics from the device to R0 Connect, which is our biosafety platform. And that allows you to see where these devices are, if they were on, and for how long they were run. And I'll show a little bit of a mock-up of that R0 Connect on a mobile device. And I think, yeah, I think I'll move on from there. So on the, over my right shoulder here in this photo, you can see the R0 Arc unit in a classroom. You can also see it here on the screen illuminated. The system is 6.5 feet tall, essentially has a floor to ceiling design. Incidentally, we did design it to be attractive looking. Many systems, particularly mobile whole room disinfection systems, are just really industrial looking and often just ugly. We tried to build a system that would be attractive, that would perhaps get your user communities talking and asking questions about it. A lot of our customers will have this front of house in the case of hospitality or restaurants. Many of the schools that leverage this have it out where parents are dropping off and they appreciate getting questions about what it is and what it's doing, so that they get the PR associated with enhanced disinfection methodologies. So 6.5 feet tall, floor to ceiling. It's designed to get up over surfaces, under surfaces, floors, walls, ceilings, high touch surfaces, as much of the air as possible in a given space, for instance, cabinets. It outputs light in a 360-degree light distribution. You can see, of course, the system is round. It's about 12 inches around, 10 inches around. We've made some interesting design, incorporated some interesting designs into the device. So for instance, each bulb has a parabolic aluminum specially coated material that's designed to push as much germicidal UVC out into the room as possible. It's one of the ways that we're able to get the levels of pathogen inactivation that we get in the times that we get. This does plug into a standard wall outlet. It draws 1440 watts. Standard wall outlet, generally 15 amp, 120 volt, will deliver 1800 watts of power. We draw 80% of that, which is by code the max that we can draw. And what that essentially means is we couldn't pack another lamp or another electrical component into this device to increase its power. It's impossible to get more UVC output in a mobile system that plugs into a standard wall outlet than this device does, which makes this the price performance leader in the market for mobile disinfection, mobile UVC disinfection. I mentioned the IoT connectivity. I'll show you that mock-up in a moment. And lastly, it's manufactured by us and our manufacturing partner in San Jose, California, which, if you're interested in buying American, can be important, but for most people, they're more concerned about the delivery times, which we can deliver quite quickly, and also support, which is US based, and we have these systems in the US. So if we need to fix or replace, we can do that quite quickly. It's a rolling system. It's 24 inches at its base with 4 3-inch casters. Rolls over just about any surface quite quickly and easily. So it's easy to move around. And lastly, I skipped it because I got ahead of myself. But from a safety standpoint, as I mentioned, at this wavelength of light in this kind of system, it's meant for unoccupied spaces. We don't want anybody inadvertently exposed to this ultraviolet light. And as such, we have these motion and infrared sensors built into the top of the unit. You might be able to see them at the top of this thing. It's kind of 4 circles around the top and an indicator light ring at the top of the unit. When the system's on, it's blue. You can actually view it from outside of space through a pane of glass on a door or a window, of course. As Andy mentioned, UVC, germicidal UVC is not powerful enough to penetrate glass. You can safely view it on the other side of a plane of glass and you'll see it illuminated in blue. If you were to walk into a space where one of these systems was actively disinfecting, it would instantly turn off, and that light at the top, that ring light, would turn red, and you'd be able to activate the disinfection cycle to pick up where it left off. You get a 30-second timer whenever you activate a disinfection cycle, and it allows you time to leave the room and close the door. And then when the disinfection cycle is done, that ring at the top turns green, and you know that process is done. And this is my last slide, and I'll shut up and I'll take questions if any. Our R0 Connect platform is designed to collect usage metrics from our suite of products. In the case of R0 Arc, you can maybe see this mock-up on a mobile device here that's showing a couple of interesting metrics. So, by the way, this is real-time data fed to our system over the air from the LTE radio. In this particular mock-up, we have a 7-day history for a main campus. This happens to be a school. We're doing business with many, many hundreds of schools and have thousands of devices in K through 12. But we can see here through the R0 Connect app that the main campus building A has a device in it that is in its pre-cycle countdown, and it just has the start time, anticipated start time, the total cycle time, time remaining in the cycle, and when the cycle is expected to start. Oops, and I just got out of my, sorry about that. Just got out of my presentation, which was unintentional, of course. Is that a minor hiccup? Can everybody see me back in action here?
You're back up, JD.
Great, sorry guys, sorry about that. I'll get used to technology eventually. We can see on the second kind of section of the mock-up here, there's a device in a kitchen that is 77% of the way through a disinfection cycle that is expected to complete at 6:47 a.m. And at the bottom, we can see that there's an auditorium disinfected 100% through a 6-minute cycle time at 6:35. What I find with the folks that we work with is that disinfection is important for disinfection itself to ensure that we're creating safe spaces for our communities, our stakeholders, our staff. And so, you know, half of the battle in disinfection is disinfection itself. The other half seems to me to be the PR around helping your communities understand what you're doing for disinfection and creating some confidence in their ability to return to your spaces and leverage those spaces and feel comfortable that they're in a space that is pathogen free, or at least where the incidence of infection is somewhat controlled, and that as a layered approach to risk reduction, you are working to ensure that you're limiting risk in your environment. So kind of a half and half, and many of our customers are posting to social media and posting these usage metrics from the systems on the front of their buildings or in certain classrooms, for instance. And so there's a sort of a PR element, in my view, to disinfection that we're attempting to assist with in providing some visibility into some historically invisible processes. And I think that is it. I will shut up and pause for questions.
Well, thank you, JD. First, I want to repeat one of the questions that was asked of Andy. Your product, like Andy's, is suitable for all viruses. Is that correct?
Yeah, for all pathogens. So that includes not just viruses, any virus, flu, common cold, any bacteria, C. diff. There's some pretty nasty stuff that does impact our environments, ringworm and things like that, molds, funguses, any pathogens in a space. There isn't a pathogen on the planet that has developed a resistance to ultraviolet light in the C-band. So by virtue of exposure, they are destroyed. And it doesn't matter what category they are in, they will be destroyed given the appropriate levels of exposure. And we do help our customers design their disinfection protocol and understand what kind of cycle lengths will be required to get to a statistical zero, a reduction, 100%, 99.99% reduction in pathogen load in a given space. And I further say that the folks that we've worked with that have deployed our systems and incorporated them into their disinfection programs and protocol are reporting back to us that they've not only controlled the incidence of infection for COVID, but in many instances, we get feedback that there isn't so much as a sniffle on campus. So common cold, flu, and others, ringworm in gyms, staph and MRSA are all problems that perhaps some districts in the case of schools have historically had that have gone away as a result of leveraging our lights.
Wonderful, thank you. An additional question, and this will tie in with one that was asked in the chat. Your product pricing and availability is also to go through From Electric. Can any attendees or members of IFMA contact Lou at From Electric for pricing and any potential engineering of space for your product?
Yes, for sure.
And does it require yours? I know Andy mentioned some of his needs professional installation. Does yours require any additional professional installation, or is it just a plug and play?
Yeah, in the case of R0 Arc, our mobile system, it's truly plug and play. That said, we do help design disinfection programs and protocols for our customers and in tandem with our customers in partnership with From and Lou. So certainly I would encourage you all to get with Lou if you're interested, and he can engage us where and when necessary. But we, it is plug and play, you plug it in, but we do some ongoing training. We have a customer success team, and we work to ensure that our customers get the most out of the system each and every day.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's sort of in concert with what Andy was saying, is that the products are installable on their own as far as Signify is concerned, but they have a team of people that help with engineering, designing, specifying, that type of thing if necessary. So it seems to be similar with R0, which is great, because it's sort of you get a two-pronged approach.
Okay, thank you, Lou and JD. Another question in the chat from one of the attendees is, UV light typically destroys furnishings, finishes. Do these products, both yours, and I'll defer back to Andy if he wants to join the conversation, do your products cause any damage or discoloration to surfaces?
We don't. In order for UVC to damage surfaces, you'd have to have pretty significant exposure times over long periods of time. One of the benefits of getting in and out quickly is there isn't an impact to materials or surfaces in terms of like fading or destruction of materials. We are doing some longer term studies on the topic, but so far we aren't seeing any degradation of anything in a given space. The caveat to that would be plants. Certain plants are more susceptible to damage. I killed all my wife's houseplants, for instance, when I was testing this around our home. And so those should be, prepped, covered, moved in accordance with your wishes and what you have in your spaces. And then, of course, any creatures that you may have in a facility. In schools, there's commonly a gerbil or a lizard in a classroom. And while they're typically in glass cases and can't be exposed to germicidal UVC, we typically recommend that they get covered.
And Andy, anything you want to add with your product?
No, I'd actually simply agree with everything he said. Is the point about long-term exposure and damage to surfaces is absolutely true. So it would take significant exposure over a long duration to damage surfaces. So for example, there are some folks out there with handheld UVC devices, and in some cases, they're actually using those in very high-end car interiors with car service companies. So short exposure, no risk of damage. Long-term exposure, potential damage. But again, it has to be very long-term exposure.
Okay, thank you both.
Welcome.
I'll now open it up for any other questions. I see none in the chat. So if anybody else has any specific questions for either JD or Andy, or for that matter, for Lou from Electric, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, well, I have one last chat. Excellent presentation from both JD and Andy. So I would concur. Thank you. This is obviously still of concern for not only the IFMA Lehigh Valley chapter members, but our whole society and community. So we absolutely appreciate your time today. Lou, any closing remarks on your end?
No, I just want to thank Andy and JD for putting on great presentations. Every time I've seen about 3 or 4 of them for both these companies, and every time I learn something new. So excellent job. And I look forward to working with both of you and your companies, and also Barb with Penn Lighting, to be a resource for this IFMA group if anybody has inquiries or wants to take this any further. But we are a team, and looking forward to supporting IFMA through what should be a very important part of whatever they decide to do with this information.
Yes, and just as a reminder, the recording, this event has been recorded. I'm going to make sure this gets up to the IFMA Lehigh Valley chapter website within a week's time. So in a week from now, you can take a look there and review it, pass it along to colleagues, share it with your facilities teams, etc. If you do need to and wish to reach out to Lou, his email is in the chat, but you can also go to their website at from.com and take a look at other products and services they provide, and certainly reach out to their team for information on both of these products that were explained today. Again, I want to thank JD and Andy for a wonderful presentation. This has certainly been enlightening for me, and certainly I hope for all of the attendees. And we look forward to future events on the IFMA chapter. You can check our website for upcoming events there. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful day, and thank you for attending.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I guess.
Thank you.